It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Our conference is called Speak for Wolves, yes, but more than that, we're a wildlife advocacy grassroots conference aimed at educating and amplifying wildlife stories to activate and inspire our audience. We couldn't do that without highlighting one of the most successful comeback stories of our generation that has the potential to benefit the world. It is my honor to introduce Tiana Williams-Claussen in her presentation on Prey-go-neesh, Condors Return Home. Tiana Williams-Claussen is a member of the Yurok Tribe. She received her BA in Biochemical Sciences from Harvard University, returned to serve her tribe, and is currently pursuing a Master's of Science in Natural Resources from California Polytech State University, Humboldt. Instrumental to the formation of the Yurok Tribe Wildlife Department, she currently serves as Department Director. Her native upbringing and formal education allow her to bridge the gap between traditional understandings of the world and those rooted in Western science, supporting a cohesive, well-informed approach to holistic ecosystem management. Tiana, thank you so much for being here today, and please take it from here.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for the introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity to share today. I am, as always, going to see if I can figure out how to share appropriately, share with sound. That's what I want to do.
You just let us know if you have any technical difficulties that we can help you with, Tiana.
I think we should be okay. Are you guys looking at my presentation screen?
We are, yes.
Perfect. I think we're there. Okay, well, again, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm very happy to talk today about a project very near and dear to my heart, which is that Keetch Prey-go-neesh, or that California condors have returned home to Yurok ancestral territory. So this is something that we've been working towards for over 14 years now. It's something I've committed my entire adult career to. And so it's very near and dear to me, as I said. And what I'm going to do today is I am not going to assume that you know everything about condors. This is a really awesome conference about wolves. And so I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction of who condors are, who we are, and why they're so important to us, and what kind of steps it took to get us to this point where we actually have condors flying in Yurok skies again. So with that, we are actually the Yurok Tribe. So we're based in far northern California, just south of the Oregon border. You can kind of see this orange boundary in the middle here. It actually is 1 mile on either side of the Klamath River. So our reservation starts at the mouth of the river and extends 44 river miles up to the village of Whitchpeck, where the Klamath meets with the Trinity. The kind of larger area, that red boundary, is our ancestral territory. So our reservation is only about 10% of our traditional territories, which means that, well, basically we have lost kind of, I guess you'd call, pure management over the whole of our ancestral territories, but we still maintain kind of our moral obligation to restore and conserve everything within it. So only having about 10% of our ancestral territories in our jurisdictional boundaries within the reservation, co-management and partnerships have been really huge. So this is actually something that we've been working towards very heavily with Redwood National and State Parks, that more khaki green that you see more towards the left. There's a lot of overlap with our ancestral territories, and there's some overlap with our reservation as well. And we're actually releasing the birds within Redwood National Parks lands where it shares boundaries with our ancestral territories. So as a bit of an introduction to the birds themselves, they are super cool, I think. They're a giant obligate scavenger, so basically a giant vulture, but they're actually the largest land-based bird in North America, with a wingspan of 9 to 9.5 feet and weighing as much as 25 pounds. Their lifespan we estimate to be about 60 plus years. We haven't actually been studying them long enough to quite know how long they can live in the wild, but we know that their near cousin, the Andean condor, can live as much as 80 years in captivity. And the oldest condor right now out in the wild is 55 years old. They are a monomorphic species. You can't tell the male from the female just by looking at them. And they form lifelong mate bonds, really focusing in on being good parents to their offspring. They actually only have one egg every other year, which they'll incubate for about 56 to 59 days, and which won't fledge until about 6 to 7 months. Now, those chicks those juveniles won't actually reach full maturity and capacity to have their own young until they're about 7 to 8 years old. So they've kind of taken that long life but slow reproduction effort, but those younglings will actually stay with their parents for that full 2-year cycle, even after they've fled, kind of learning from their parents where all the good food is, where all the good water is, how to navigate the airways so that they can be as fit as possible when they are kind of let off on their own at about 2 years old. Now, as a Yurok tribal member and as a Yurok biologist, the reason that we're so interested in condors is because of their integral role to our kind of cultural identity. And so our cultural identity is very closely tied with our physical world as well. There's not a lot of separation between the two. But the way that it expresses culturally is particularly with our world renewal ceremonies. And we consider ourselves to be world renewal people. We consider that to be our foundational reason for being. Now, because of that, this scavenger, this person who literally goes out across the landscape and cleans things up, is a very integral part of our world renewal ceremonies. Actually just attended one of our high ceremonies this last week, and it was an incredible experience. I did not see them, but somebody told me that we actually had condors flying over the dance. But regardless, our relationship with condor goes all the way back to the beginning of time, when the spirits of the world, the animals of the world, were really the people of the world, even before humans really became what we are today. And they were teaching us how to move forward in a good way and how to keep the world in balance. And it was at that time that Condor, who we know particularly as being a generous and kind-hearted individual, gave us the Condor song, which we sing in our high ceremonies and which teaches us the importance of kindness. He actually grants his feathers to our ceremonies, which we use in our regalia, and which carry his spirit, that kind-hearted spirit, into it. My family at least taught that they're never to be harmed, so any feathers that we receive are gifts from the birds. And finally, he actually flies the highest of any other bird in our area, and so he carries our prayers to the heavens when we're asking for the world to be in balance. But he's been locally extirpated for 130 years. So there's been this huge ecological and cultural hole in our world. So ultimately, all of this said, there was a panel of our elders who were specifically identified for their ability to prioritize cultural and natural resource restoration needs, who voted that Prey-go-neesh, the California condor, was the single most important species to return to Yurok ancestral territory, above and ahead any other species that might be struggling. Not because it has any greater role, but just because he's so iconic. He's so iconic and so signifies this world renewal ethic that we have. And in fact, we got started on our work in 2008, and he was the start of our wildlife department. And since then, we've moved on to all kinds of wildlife restoration, conservation needs, just as our elders had originally had thought would be the case. So condors themselves are actually really awesome birds. They're very adaptable. Their Pleistocene range actually went all the way up to what's now British Columbia, down to Baja California, what's now the United States, and up into New York. But by the 1850s, their range had kind of stayed the same north to south, but had greatly shrunk westward. And by the 1950s, they had been reduced to just this red wishbone that you see in Central and Southern California. And they actually got down to just 22 individuals left in the entire world, largely due to human-related mortality factors. So particularly post-1850s and the California gold rush, there was just a huge influx of a lot more people than the system could sustain. And honestly, there was changes in how wildlife were managed. So there's a major loss of the reduction in megafauna that they rely on. They really like those big game animals like deer and elk, as well as bear, California sea lions, and whales. They like food that for their big mass, it's worth the risk of landing for. There was direct human take. People would kill both condors and eggs, either out of fear or admiration. There was habitat loss. In our area, that was the old growth redwoods that they like to nest and roost in, and actually the loss of the extensive prairie systems that used to maintain the food resources they were required, and which as tribal people we had maintained through traditional burning quite expansively. In talking to our environmental department, who's done some assessments of this, our prairie, for example, is only 1% of what it used to be historically, and so that's a major loss for them. There was what we call incidental poisoning, where people would put out carcasses laced with poison for more traditional carnivores like wolves or large cats, and the condors would eat them and die. And there actually remain two issues that are still impacting condors today, a lot of these other issues having been at least somewhat addressed through 20th century conservation methods. But that includes DDT contamination and lead toxicity. I'll talk more about the lead toxicity later. It's actually the #1 cause of condor mortality in the wild and has been found to be caused by the use of lead ammunition. But in any case, as I mentioned, their population declined to just 22 individuals by 1982, leaving them pretty much the most endangered bird out there, at least in our neck of the woods. And it was at that point that they decided to start a captive rearing program, which was very successful and which ultimately resulted in birds being re-released into Central and Southern California, managed by Ventana Wildlife Society, Pinnacles National Park, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the Arizona Department of Game and Fish and the Peregrine Fund in kind of the Arizona-Utah region as well. But why I love condors so much, particularly, and not even just because of their deep cultural importance to me as a tribal member, is kind of their power as both an ecological and cultural keystone species for all peoples and for this entire world. So by at least one definition, an ecological keystone species is a species that has an inordinate impact on its environment based on its population size. And certainly scavengers fill that role. As some of you may, for example, be aware of the vulture die-offs that happened in the India subcontinent and surrounding areas, seemingly caused by medications that were being used in animals there. But there was just major havoc that was wreaked. There was all of these animals that were now not being broken down like they should be. That resulted in large packs of wild dogs, that resulted in increases in rabies and other diseases. And they calculated that literally billions in ecosystem services were now lost because their vulture populations had been sent into decline. Now, a cultural keystone species is a species that has an inordinate impact on kind of the cultural narrative of the region in which it lives. Now, for us, condors are a cultural keystone species as tribal people because they're so tied to our world renewal ceremonies and in our belief system. He gave us this foundation of who we are, or at least contributed to it. But on a much broader narrative, I think that condors are incredibly important to the conservation narrative, which is very much an important cultural development within modern America. So they're actually one of the first animals on the endangered species list. And given their massive recovery, there's actually more than 500 birds now, about 300 of which are in the wild. They're a major success story. They're also very charismatic, very social. You can get to know them. And there's countless individuals out there who love condors and who want to make the world a better place because of them. So they're now having a much broader cultural impact than even just to the tribal peoples. And it's there that this kind of ecological and cultural keystone species things combine. Because while they've certainly got their very clear ecological role, and they've clearly had an impact on the culture of people, because the impact that they're having is driving us as people to make the world fit for them again, they're having both an inordinate impact on their ecology and an inordinate impact on their kind of cultural narrative in modern America. And so I really like condors because that makes sense to me. As I mentioned in the beginning, there's not a lot of differentiation between ecology and culture in the way that I view the world. And I think that that's something that we kind of need to get back to as a human race in order to make the best positive moves for our world and repair a lot of the damage that's been done. But they're also an indicator of when things aren't going right. I often say if you've got a bad environment for condors, you've got a bad environment for everybody. And so there's a lot of parallels that I see as a tribal person with their near destruction and our near destruction. So for example, they suffered from reduction in megafauna. We suffered from the loss of those same species. They suffered from human take. We suffered from massacres and theft of children. And I think for similar reasons, because both condors and ourselves were considered to be lesser beings, and you could do these sort of things. And that's not a good attitude to have about humans or the wildlife that we coexist with. There was habitat loss. We suffered removal from our home to the reservation, and then could not take care of the land and also suffered from not being cared for by the lands. And of course, there's poisoning and DDT and lead toxicity, and there's been a whole host of introduction of new toxic elements like alcohol and drugs and diseases that have caused problems for tribal peoples. And so really, I guess the point here is that we saw this destruction hit our environment and literally drove condors extinct and almost drove us extinct at the same time, just really highlighting how closely, again, our system and our humanity are tied together. It's really iconic to me because as condor were disappearing from the landscape, which for us was about to turn into the 20th century, we were losing very important parts of ourselves. It was actually illegal to practice tribal religion. It was illegal to speak the tribal language. Some of the largest massacres in our areas happened during our high ceremonies, our world renewal ceremonies. And so as condors disappeared from the landscape, so did our high ceremonies because they were no longer safe to hold. Now, they weren't forgotten, but they were, as I kind of consider it, banked until it was safe to celebrate them again. And so, for example, this is a picture of our white deerskin dance. I didn't mention this is by local artist Lynn Risling. She's Karuhupa and Yurok descent. We all kind of share this ideology, and it depicts our high ceremonies. This is our white deerskin dance. And so it was actually one of the eldest of our elders, who was one of the last to have danced the white deerskin dance back in the day, who was a leader in reinstituting the white deerskin dance after many years. Again, these world renewal dances. And not only was it his vision that helped bring this back, but just the incredible support from the community, which I think is, again, very much paralleled for condors. There were people who were just like, this can't be done. We can't save them. Let them go with dignity. What is it going to be to have birds in captivity? How are they going to be reintroduced to the wild without having any sort of, mentorship to guide them in what it is to be a wild condor, which is entirely valid concerns. But there were people who had so much love for them and understood how important they were for the system that they went for it. And I can't even begin to describe how many people contribute to condor restoration now. But again, they are so much better off than they are. And both of these stories are really good parallels of how when you've got a vision and the community behind you, you can make real change happen. But again, so these dances are healing the world again. As I mentioned, I was actually at our jump dance, which is the other half of our world renewal ceremonies this last week. And I'm told that condors did come to visit. These dances are healing the world again, and condors are back in our skies to be carrying our prayers to the heavens. But to get to this point was 14 years of work. And so one of the things that we really wanted to make sure is that, yes, we wanted to bring condors home, but was it a good move for condors themselves? So some of the questions we wanted to answer, and we actually initially got funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to answer this, was, is there available habitat for condors to carry out necessary life history activities? So that's nesting, roosting, rearing, foraging, and the like. Will marine mammal-derived DDT levels limit recovery in Northern California because it remains a problem for condors? Will lead limit recovery in Northern California? And knowing that it is associated with use of lead ammunition, what are the attitudes of Northern California hunters, and will they accept non-lead ammunition as a viable alternative? I am a GIS junkie, so I'm really sad about how quickly I'm going to run over this. But a lot of the work that we did for habitat analyses was geospatial work, where we layered kind of the things that we knew condors needed, like good flight corridors, access to open prairies, access to marine resources, good roosting and nesting trees, which are often tied with old growth. Is there available habitat for condors to carry out necessary life history once we start layering all of these pieces of information together? And so the quick answer is yes. All of this dark blue and this green that you see on here is good to excellent condor habitat, at least based on the modeling. And I personally love to see that some of the places I see on here are actually places that my elders told me they used to have condors, that they used to be very popular. So that's very encouraging in terms of the conservation metrics that kind of brought our world closer to being back in balance so that condors could come back home. For example, the area that we're releasing them in Redwood National State Parks has the largest remaining extant old growth redwood and the largest prairie systems in our area. So it was a really obvious choice for where we wanted to release the birds. So the next thing that we really looked at is, will DDT contaminant levels limit recovery in Northern California? And we got at that by looking at marine mammals of stranded animals that had died and washed ashore. And the reason we looked at that is because DDT is a lipophilic, so a fat binding molecule that bioaccumulates in long-lived blubbery animals like California sea lions and harbor seals and whales of various sorts. And we're particularly concerned about marine resources because of major DDT contamination that happened in the ocean. For example, the Montrose chemical spill in Southern California. We weren't too concerned about our area being overly contaminated, but we were concerned about these long-lived animals, particularly migratory, traveling to more contaminated areas, bioaccumulated, and then coming back to our shores to die. So this remains a problem for the Central California flock managed by Ventana Wildlife Society. Good and bad news there. About 50% of their eggs are suffering from contamination. About 50% of their eggs are thriving without intervention. So the use of DDT was actually banned in the 1970s. So we're not putting more of it into the environment. It should only be going down from there. And so they're on the upward turn. But how did we compare? So the problem with DDT, of course, is eggshell thinning. You have an example here of a Southern California egg where they don't actually use marine resources, and it has a surface crystalline layer, which offers integrity and shape and water retention to the egg. The egg captured from Central California around the Big Sur flock is completely lacking the surface crystalline layer. So that egg will either break when the parents brood it, or it will lose water and won't survive without human intervention. So one of the things that they sometimes do is they'll actually go into nests, see about the egg viability, and if it's not viable, replace it with a viable egg. Or if it is viable, but maybe they're not sure about it, they might replace it with a dummy egg and incubate it in the hopes of saving that egg. But it's a lot more work than you want to be doing for a wild flock who you want to thrive on its own. But thankfully, the results that we got were very encouraging. This is a particular graph of our California sea lions. So you can see the Southern California bite. The California sea lions there are very contaminated, and that comes with issues for those animals, and hopefully we can mediate that and get rid of it. But the Central California flock, that blue bar in the middle, that's the level of contamination that's currently having kind of this 50-50 impact on the Ventana's flock. But our levels in Northern California, the little green bar that says 18.64 is actually about 4 times lower than the California sea lion studied in their areas. So I can't say that we won't have a problem with DDT. The proof will be in the pudding, but I'm very hopeful that reproduction at least won't be a problem in our area. I left the best/worst for last, which is the threat from lead contamination. It does cause 50% of known mortality of wild condors. And the way that it's getting into the system is through use of lead ammunition, lead being a very soft metal that fragments heavily upon impact and which can leave literally hundreds of pieces of lead in the animal taken. So here, for example, there's 547 fragments of lead. Now, if the animal gets picked up and taken away, most of it's fine. Humans are impacted differently, though, of course, lead is not good for anybody. But if it gets into the gut pile, a piece as small as a head of a pin is enough to kill a condor, as well as a bald eagle or a golden eagle, as well as a host of other scavenging species. So we really need to see, is lead a problem here? And if it is, what do we do about it? We got somewhat mixed results there. So this is an example of our lead contamination study, which we did on turkey vultures being the nearest extant cousin in this area. And so 24%, almost 1 in 4 of our turkey vultures were found to have an elevated blood lead level higher than what we would consider baseline or standard, and at a level that would be problematic for condors. 1 in 4 is way too many. The good news on that side is it's still lower than any place else that turkey vultures have been studied, including in areas where condors are currently persisting with care from the Condor Care Recovery Program, or California Condor Recovery Program. Now you can see there's where the bar on the far left, that says 24%. You can also see a study done in Mendocino County, which is to the south of us, and they have an outside and inside of deer hunting study. We couldn't do that because our vultures are actually migrating during the hunting season, so you can't get a good snapshot of what's going on locally. But you can see there's a very clear dichotomy between the amount of lead they're finding outside of deer hunting season, that central one with 36%, and inside of hunting with that 66%. And we actually replicated that with our common ravens as well, being non-migratory. We had a lower level outside of hunting season, a higher level inside of hunting season. And this was expected because lead is the most conventionally used material for ammunition out there. But knowing this, and even before we finished our turkey vulture studies, because hey, lead's not good for anybody, we started our Hunters as Stewards project, which is something that's actually done across all of California condor recovery. And basically what that was us reaching out first to the tribal hunting community, but then to the much broader hunting community to talk about the impacts of the use of lead ammunition and to talk about alternatives and to reach out to the hunting community and their really strong conservation ethic to say, hey, we'd love it if you became partners with us in condor conservation by switching to non-lead ammunition. And so we did surveys along with this because we were just starting out in our program. We wanted to see how effective it was. And anywhere, depending on the event, anywhere from 85 to 95% of the hunters we talked to said, I had no idea this was a problem. And of course, I'll make a switch to non-lead ammunition. And not only are we getting people coming back to us say, yeah, I made the switch. I never went back. It's great. But now when I go and give youth talks, I've got youth that I give this same talk to, and they said, oh yeah, my dad uses that. My grandpa uses that, and it's great. So we're becoming intergenerational now, which is incredibly hopeful for me that eventually this issue will be beat. We kind of took that same approach for our whole condor recovery program. Of course, some people are concerned when you're talking about reintroducing an endangered species because it can impact the way that people do business. But so we actually developed a memorandum of understanding in support of bringing condors home, initially signed by just 5 partners, the Yurok Tribe, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service and California State Parks through our partners, Redwood National and State Parks, and then Ventana Wildlife Society. But with time, we expanded that to all kinds of federal, state, nonprofit, and even industry partners who we went to, said, hey, we want to do this thing. What are your concerns? How do we address them? And then they came to us as partners. So this has just been a really incredible experience over the last 14 years. We went through a very long regulatory process. It took about 6 years, which is very long for something like this, but we got literally thousands of comments on them, most of them quite positive, but some with some very good constructive feedback. And so a lot of this complexity was about the fact that we were proposing it as a non-essential experimental population under 10J of the Endangered Species Act. And so what that allows you to do is to custom craft the protections for the endangered species being discussed. So condors in and of themselves are actually highly adaptable. They are very curious. They're not upset by loud noises because, of course, with things going on, that's often where food is happening and stuff like that. If you cut down a roost tree, they'll just find another one. But what it does is it allows you to prioritize those things that are important for conservation of species while deprioritizing things that may not be, an impact to the species, but which would negatively impact the region. So for example, there's tons of protections for breeding areas for the birds and for breeding timelines. But if you scare a bird off of a tree, which would be take under full endangered species protection, that condor is going to be just fine. Ultimately, we were co-leads on the environmental assessment process. Us, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which was incredible in itself. Usually tribes don't get to have that lead role and equal decision power. But we resulted in getting a finding of no significant impact, which we received in March 23rd of 2021, which really gave us the federal go-ahead to, hey, start releasing birds into the wild. And of course, this was right in the middle of all the construction crises where there was no materials and costs were being driven up and contractors weren't available. But we pushed, and we actually got our facility established in that area that I'm kind of highlighting right here, which kind of borders the Redwood National Park lands and Yurok ancestral territories, built and completed, I'm going to say pretty much exactly a year later, like maybe March 23rd of 2022. And so this is the facility that we built, and there's about 3 parts to it. The one is the flight pen, which while they're in our care is where they'll spend the majority of their time. There is also a observation area. You can kind of see it in the background there. It's actually built of used shipping containers. And so it is completely fireproof, which is great because there's actually been several facilities lost to fire over the course of the Condor Recovery Program. But it also has one-way glass that we can observe the birds from, but which they can't see us. And then we just try really hard to not expose them to humans. So keeping really quiet, doing any care of them or the facilities in the cover of nighttime so that they don't see us. The third part is what we call the double door trap. And the double door trap is kind of a funnel. So if I have birds in the flight pen, but I want to release them, I can put a carcass in the double door trap. And then there's doors to the flight pen. I can lure the bird that I want in to go after the carcass. Then I close the door behind him. Then when he's ready or she's ready, we can open a door to the outside and let them free. Simultaneously, we can use it the other way. So we can open a door to the outside, lure a bird in that we want to capture, close the door, and then open the door to the flight pen, thus keeping any birds inside or outside that we want in the proportions that we want. And so that was completed March 23rd of 2022, I'd say, and we received our first bird March 25th of 2022. So it was quite the push. Oh, and I didn't mention this. Other things that our facility has is actually a predator exclusion fence. We do have a large cat and a large bear population in our area. And so this is a 12-foot fence that encompasses the entire area around our release facility, giving them a good place to be. Young birds, basically, they're still figuring out what they're doing. It gives them a safe space, basically. So it's a 12-foot fence, but then it also has an electrified wire around it, particularly for the bears. And we were also able to build our Condor Management and Operations Center, we call it, which is basically our office, through contributions from Redwood National Park. This actually used to be an old building of theirs that was slated for demolition and was not in a great state, but which we were able to get funding from the Administration for Native Americans to make into this really beautiful facility. And it's kind of our prime operation center. We call the larger field site our release and management facility. But so, yeah, we received our first bird, which is actually 746. You can see him in the middle in the lower left picture there. He is an adult condor, turned 8 not too long ago, unfortunately unreleasable. He came to visit us from the Peregrine Friends Boise World Center of Birds of Prey to kind of be a mentor for these young birds and teach them what it is to be an adult condor. We also received 4 juvenile condors, and so they're about 2 to 3 years old and designated A0 through A3. Now, these are birds that were reared in captivity. They have never been in the wild before. And so they've got quite a bit to learn before they are full-fledged, successful condors. And so I have a particular love for them because they are going to show the way to every other condor that comes after them. But they're incredibly important, and having this mentor to kind of teach them social hierarchy, safe behaviors, and ultimately kind of act like a social draw to them by staying in the facility helps them both fly out into the world and figure out how to be good condors, but also to keep coming back home so that we can keep tabs on them, especially in their first couple of years while they figure out the ropes. So they teach young birds how to be condors. They establish dominance hierarchies. They've got a very strict dominance. They focus their attention on adult type behavior and then act as social magnets. Now, we'll see if I can make this work. This is actually a video of our first release, which happened on May 2nd. Always probably one of the trickiest things for a presentation. But there's sound on if you want it. Hey, it's working from my end. If it's not from anybody else's, let me know.
Working for us, yeah.
I'm Tiana Williams-Claussen. I'm the director of the Yurok Tribe Wildlife Department, and I am currently sitting up at the Northern California Condor Restoration Program's Release and Management Facility, overlooking both our 4 juvenile birds, hopefully soon to be released. Apologies to anybody listening, but we must keep our silence as much as we can, so I am speaking in a voiceless whisper. We don't actually want them to know that we're here. It's really important for the birds' health and wellness that they have as little exposure to humans as possible.
This is the handle that we're on the bush.
So the birds are free. That was A3 and A2. This is a picture of A3 out in the wild. We don't name our birds per se, but we do nickname them. The reason we don't name them is because we believe that they maintain their spirit self, and that they are, they're not dumb animals. They're a member of the wildlife community. They have their own language, and they probably have their own names for themselves. But it is traditional in our area that as you take major milestones in your life, that you receive a nickname. And so we provide them a nickname as part of introducing them and bring them into our community. A3 was nicknamed Prey-go-neesh, which literally means the one who goes out ahead. He was the first to fly out. And it also is a traditional name for the headman of our village who kind of lead the way for our peoples. Prey-go-neesh ended up being super accurately named. He took off just like you saw, and he went on his own journey for about 2 weeks and never came back. He learned a ton of good flying skills out there, how to roost well, how to fly from point A to point B, how to capture those thermals. We saw him kettling with a flock of turkey vultures, got really high, and that's actually when he came back to the facility. A2, we nicknamed Nesquichok, which means he returns or he arrives. And that was both for him, but kind of indicative of the broader flock, as well as with condors having returned to Yurok ancestral territory for the first time in 130 years. But again, his name worked out really well. He ended up being a home buddy. He would take his flies out to the trees nearby. He'd circle around a little bit, but every night he would come back to the facility and feed on the carcass that we would leave out there regularly to make sure he had food, and just do that day in and day out. Once A3 came home, and they are absolutely the best of buds, by the way, they are just the best friends. He started venturing out a little bit more, but he's still kind of our home buddy. We next released a couple weeks later, A0. She's the only female in the bunch. We released them in small groups of 2 or 1 so that we can really focus on each bird released and make sure that it's healthy and well before we put any focus on the next bird. So we released those 2 at once so they'd have each other, but it wouldn't be too much for us to manage. And A0 came a couple weeks later. We nicknamed Negam Netwing Ka, which means she carries her prayers, our prayers. And in my mind, that was both a reference to their traditional role as the carriers of our prayers, but also just the fact that there are so many people in our community and the surrounding condor community who are praying for her well-being, as well as all condors. So wherever she goes, she carries her prayer. Oof, I forgot to add a picture of A1. I apologize. A1 was our last bird released. He was released later than everybody else by about a month because he had a faulty transmitter, unfortunately. So once he actually was ready to be released by getting a new transmitter, all these other guys left within minutes of, well, it was probably within half a day of us trying to get them into the DDT, and then they would fly right out. A1 was not interested. We went out there about 8 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday to try and lure him into the DDT to release him, and he just didn't want to go in. We called about 4 o'clock because you want them to have enough light to get around. Tried the next day, same thing, didn't want to go in. Finally, on the 3rd day, we went in there before he even started stirring. So it was like 5 o'clock in the morning, and made sure that we were watching. He went in to get his food. He'd been snacking super early in the morning. We closed the door behind him and we released him. He was nicknamed Plahalet, which means finally I fly, which was both a reference to the fact that he had to wait so long and the fact that he chose to keep waiting. And we saw that finally he flew. And of course, the fact that all 4 of our first cohort are now finally flying free in Yurok country. Our lead condor biologist, Chris West, is actually en route to Idaho to the Boise World Center of Birds of Prey to pick up our next cohort. So these are stud book numbers 1091, 1098, 1101, and 1109, who will be designated A4 through A7. Our first birds were designated A0 through A4. And so they are actually going to be back and processed and tagged with their transmitters and their visual tags, hopefully by Tuesday. So that's going to be pretty incredible. The way that we actually manage them, it is intensive management because they still are a highly endangered species and every condor matters immeasurably. But so our overall approach is to release 4 to 6 birds per year. We're doing 2 cohorts of 4 this year because usually you do releases in the fall, but because of delays in getting everything going and the construction and all that, our first cohort was actually released in the spring, being followed by the second cohort in the fall, and then we'll continue on the fall schedule from now on out. So normally 4 to 6 birds per year. We receive birds at 2 to 3 years of age from the captive rearing programs. They'll be allowed to kind of acclimatize in the field release and management facility for several months, 1 to 3. And then, as I said, releases will occur as pairs or singly, so we can really focus on their care. And we're going to at least keep 746 through this next cohort, though he may return home after that to contribute to the breeding population. Every bird has transmitters and tags, both a single wing-mounted satellite transmitter and an alphanumeric visual tag, so that A0, A1, as well as, here I say, a single tail-mounted radio transmitter. Initially, they're actually on the wing because at this age, they're molting their feathers on their tail too quickly. But once the transmitters get replaced, which they have to do regularly, that'll go on the tail. And so this gives you both redundancy in our tracking ability, but also kind of 2 analyses that we can do. The satellite transmitters give us the capacity to analyze their home ranges, any risks they may be encountering, what sort of habitat they're using, and important resources they're finding. And it also allows us to engage with landowners and managers who have key resources that are of interest to condors to help make sure that they are partners in this conservation effort. The radio transmitters are what we use in the field. They send out a little ping, ping, and we use Yagi or omnidirectional receivers to find the birds in the field so that we can actually lay eyes on them and make sure that they're healthy and well. The satellite transmitters come with a mortality signal. So if the bird doesn't move in too long, we know we absolutely have to go find that bird. It could be sick, it could be injured, or worst case scenario, it could be dead, in which case we want to recover the carcass and figure out why it died. Sometimes they just drop too, in which case we find the transmitter and we know that we have to capture that bird to put the transmitter back on. We will conduct biannual trap-ups. This is pretty standard across all California condor recovery programs, both in the spring and the fall. This includes a physical check to make sure that the bird is well, transmitter and tag maintenance, and then a blood draw, largely focusing on lead contamination. If they've got lead in their blood, we want to make sure to get them any treatment they need, but also potentially checking for disease agents and things like that as well. Ultimately, our long-term vision is that the lower human populations in the Pacific Northwest may reduce human condor conflict. As mentioned, almost all of their mortality factors come from humans, which we'd like to change. Ultimately, we hope to release 120 birds over 20 years. They will start reproducing probably in about 5 to 6 years, which will grow that population as well. We do consider Northern California to just be the next phase of condor recovery. This is building on decades and decades of work that's already just been incredible. But we also consider our area to be kind of the gateway to the Pacific Northwest. They definitely used to range up along the coast and along the Columbia, and there's interest by many to see them flying in Oregon and Washington skies as well. Ultimately, our dream, of course, is birds without tags that we don't have to manage and which thrive and flourish without human intervention. That will represent recovery. As a Yurok tribal member, what I'm looking for locally is to have condors reintegrated into kind of the ecological cultural system that we had co-evolved along with them. Every animal having its role, every animal having its place. Again, not managed by us, but just seamlessly integrated. I always like to close with this picture. I'm just incredibly honored because it was the dream of our elders to make this happen. It was in their hearts. They had held on to our knowledge and our relationship with condors through over a century of absence. I'm very privileged to have taken their knowledge and their dream and transmit it to my own daughter and to all the tribal youth in our area so that they can grow up in relationship with condors in a way that I never had the opportunity to do. And sure enough, my little one, she's just 4. She absolutely loves Prey-go-neesh, always asking for pictures, always asking for videos. And I'm just incredibly honored to be the person, or not the person, but one of the people who's helped contribute to making this happen. With that, I will say Wachlau, so deepest thanks for your attention. If you're interested in our department, our program, you can go to yuroktribe.org/wildlife. And we also maintain both a Facebook and a Twitter campaign, both Yurok Condors and at Yurok Condors, which you can find. That's kind of where we provide most of our updates. And if I always feel awkward saying this, but if you'd like to support the program, you can go to the website and there's actually a way to not only donate potential funding, we are 100% grant funded, but ways that you can contribute as citizen science and the like as well. So with that, I will close. I think we've still got some time for questions. And thank you very much.
Tiana, thank you so much for that. I think that there's a little bit of echo. My apologies. Birds were always my first love, and I just happened to get into wolf work. So it's really wonderful, this marriage of bird and wolf and conservation in general. Please continue to promote what you're doing, and we would love for everyone to visit the Yurok page. And I believe that some of my colleagues will put the links in the chat. Someone mentioned that there are condor cams that stream to public in the pens, and there have been some links put in the chat there as well. So we do have a couple questions, Tiana. Thank you for allowing some time for this. What are the obstacles to getting lead shot banned that you're seeing right now?
In California, actually, the use of lead ammunition has been 100% banned. That went into effect in 2019. The obstacle that I think goes along with that is, unfortunately, California tends to be ammunition legislation, and hunters are sensitive to that. I myself am a hunter. I live in a very conservative area, and I understand that. So there's a few different reasons for hunters who do want to transition. Just I'm going to repeat my answer. I was saying that lead actually has been banned in California, but there's complications associated with that. One kind of a social pushback against the legislative impact, which
Tiana,
audio issues too.
I think that we're having some audio issues.
Let me see, check my internet. It says it's connected. Speaker?
No, that's okay.
Hear me?
I think it's still coming in. If you want to stop sharing your screen, maybe that might help a little bit with the bandwidth. Can you hear me?
You. Can you hear me? I'll turn off my video.
Okay.
Is any better? Can you guys hear me?
It's still coming in a little fuzzy.
Yeah, that's the part of living in a rural area. We're supposed to have the best internet. Well, I'll keep talking, and you guys can catch it again. I will try and do a quick type up of my responses as well as soon as I finish with them. So lead.
Rosie, sorry, Tiana, it's still breaking up a little bit. Rosie, can you try muting your side? I'm wondering if it's feedback happening. Thanks. Sorry, Tiana, can you try again?
Can you guys hear me okay? Any better luck?
If not, and I'm not sure what's going on. I wonder if you could try turning your volume down on your end, Tiana. Maybe the feedback is coming through on your end.
Is that any better?
Yes.
Okay.
Very much
well,
so.
hopefully that was the problem then. Okay, start over again one more time. Lead has been banned in California fully as of 2019 for use in hunting, but there's complications both from the legislative approach and for hunters themselves who want to make the transition. One, California is highly legislated when it comes to guns and ammunition, and hunters tend to have an automatic rejection of that sort of thing. I myself am a hunter. I come from a conservative area. I can understand this. But beyond that, it just wasn't explained to a lot of people. There wasn't a lot of effort put into that outreach on a broad scale. And so it's being imposed, but nobody knows why. Complications that go along with that, if aren't convinced, if they don't know why, there's not a lot of capacity for monitoring. A, because there's not enough wardens out there. California just doesn't have the funding, but B, because you can't look at most ammunition and just tell if it's lead or non-lead. So it's hard to just, monitor that way. But even for those who do want to comply, there's a huge amount of ammunition shortage here, non-lead, lead, regardless. And so people are not able to find what they want. So the importance of continuing to do outreach to the hunting community and sporting groups cannot be overemphasized to make sure that people are convinced and that they do everything that they can to use solely non-lead ammunition. Now, myself, I kind of come from a place of privilege. I can afford to, buy meat to put on my table. So I can say, if I don't have non-lead, I don't hunt. Some people, particularly in our area, don't have that. We have one of the highest poverty rates in California in our region. And so we're also working to be able to provide non-lead ammunition to our community so that if they have difficulties finding it or they can't afford it, but they want to make that transition, then we can support them in that way.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tiana. Why is number 746 unreleasable?
My understanding is, unfortunately, he just kind of developed some bad habits that he got they do absolutely everything they can to make sure that they don't get humanized. A lot of the same things that I was describing, but he just latched onto humans and became very human focused. And as with most wildlife, if they become very human focused, they put a lot of risk on themselves. With condors being such a social bird, there's potential other impacts, so that if he has bad habits, he may teach bad habits to other birds. And so it's better for the whole flock and for him that he remain home. And as I said, potentially contribute to the captive rearing program, which is also a very necessary and critical job.
Still has a job.
Yeah.
Still very important. This question is from Griff. Is the tribe talking about any future reintroductions of other species, grizzly bear, martens?
Right now, I'd say we're focusing more on improving our habitat for the species that are currently extant. So for example, if you mentioned martens, we've got a very, I would like to think, proactive approach to habitat restoration for martens. A lot of what they're struggling with in our area is the lack of that old growth habitat that they prefer. And while we're finding that they're a lot more adaptable and can use more lands than we previously thought, for example, we have redevised our forestry program to kind of recreate old growth, late sterile forest structure on an accelerated timeline. So a lot of the lands that we've actually repurchased so that we can manage them are young forest, very dense, monoculture, single age, having previously been under conventional timber harvest. So we're going in and we are selectively harvesting to reduce the density, to allow the trees that exist to grow more quickly, become kind of those large bore, old growth type trees, and also reduce a lot of the fire risk that is very inherent to our area with these unhealthy, overly dense forests. We're also doing uneven age management so that we can add complexity to the forest. So we're doing this very patchily. So here you've got some younger trees, some older trees, and then you provide a diversity of habitat, not only for martens who need these things, but for northern spotted owl, marbled murrelet, and the like. We're talking about generations worth of work to get these forests back into shape, but that's what we're doing there. One species in particular that we kind of want to reintroduce, and if this is Griffin, he's probably quite aware of them, is the elk population, which is pretty abundant in our area, but which is pretty low in actually Yurok tribal lands. And that's because of the loss of our prairies, which they are dependent on. Again, through overplanting for timber or because of the loss of traditional fire, which caused them to become overgrown. So they're everywhere around us, but we don't have the habitat to support them within tribal territory. So we're also doing a lot of prairie restoration, or at least working towards that in order to bring them back into Yurok ancestral lands. Otherwise, beavers and porcupines are our next interest too. They're way lower than they should be, and they're incredible ecosystem engineers that are necessary for our system.
Well, that's great to hear. Thanks so much, Tiana. And this question comes from Linda, kind of along the same vein. Is climate change affecting the habitat of condors in this area?
Not so much in this area that we can see. I mean, but that's kind of conjecture at this point, because obviously the world is quite different than it was back in the day. And we've only got 4 birds out there, so we've got a very limited end. But condors are very adaptable. I don't think I mentioned it, but they can actually fly 100 to 200 miles in a day. So wherever they are, if they're not quite finding what they want right there, they can probably find it someplace else. Now, that said, it is something that we had considered when we were talking about releasing them. And I actually did an unofficial, it's not peer reviewed or anything like that, but I did an unofficial GIS analysis of how our world would look in both the best and worst case climate scenarios that are coming along. And the good news there is that based off the way that they're using the landscape down south and in the Southwest, our landscape is going to maintain those kind of climate and wind and temperature sort of positive benefits on the longer term. All of that said, our biggest concern right now is fire. So they actually, some of you may be aware, like I mentioned, they lost several of their management facilities to fire within the broader condor recovery program. But for example, Tiana Wildlife Society also lost, I think it was 9 birds a couple of years ago because they don't fly at night and the fire switched direction and raced through a roosting area that they had. And that was like 1/10 of their population almost. So we do definitely still have concerns. Once we get our forests and our prairies back into a good state, hopefully fire will be less of a concern, but that's not anytime soon. So that's something we're really watching out for.
Thank you so much, Tiana. And I have one more question for you. It's interesting that a 10J was pursued and the condor is deemed as a non-essential population versus the cultural significance of the condor. Is the federal process considering cultural significance when it comes to reintroduction of species, considering the success of this species?
From my understanding, the 10J, which is actually, technically speaking, a strictly U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determination, there's kind of it was one of the options within the environmental assessment, but the actual determination and the division of the rules and all that sort of stuff is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service process. My understanding, it is largely an ecological sort of thing. So while I myself would say that condors are not non-essential, they are extremely essential to our region and to our culture. If this population were to wink out entirely, the population as a whole would continue to survive in the areas that it is. This is actually a very disjunct population that's part of which will contribute to recovery, but it also protects the rest of the population if anything catastrophic should happen here, like a major disease outbreak or something like that. So I would say they are definitely essential, but from kind of that practical management standpoint, if we fail, heaven forfend, condors will continue to thrive.
Thank you for entertaining that question, Tiana. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for your time today.